The fourth generation of Pokemon has always been a favorite of mine. Perhaps that is due in part to the fact that this was the last Pokemon generation I took part in before putting away this franchise for being too childish, as I thought at the time. While I obviously rediscovered my affinity for the franchise and its all-ages audience appeal, something always whispered in the back of my mind that this was the last great entry in the Pokemon series, and honestly, I don't know why I always thought that. Sure, I love the visuals and many of the new Pokemon species, but when I started working on this video, I was a little worried about what I would say, because this may be one of my favorite generations of Pokemon, but on the surface, I didn't know what could really be discussed, other than the obvious changes to the visual aesthetics that came from the transition from Game Boy Advance to Nintendo DS. I felt as though the fourth and possibly also the fifth generation titles of the Pokemon series were, for lack of a better term, plain. This was an era in the Pokemon franchise during which we didn't see enormous change or drastically different features between each generation. No new types, the return of many similar features to third generation, and we hadn't quite reached the additions of Mega Evolutions, 3D graphics, regional forms, and the like. I thought that this would make analyzing the fourth generation difficult, because it wasn't new and exciting, it was just the next Pokemon game. But as I played, I realized what that actually meant, and what the Pokemon developers had been focusing on. It wasn't about making things different, it was just about making things better. While things weren't constantly changing, this gave the development team time to really improve the aspects that fit well, or maybe just needed a little improvement here and there. This was an era during which Pokemon as a gaming series became comfortable and familiar, and players were given the opportunity to enjoy finding new Pokemon and incorporating them into the gameplay experience they already understood, rather than spending the majority of their adventure trying to learn all the new ins and outs. We'll figure out exactly what sorts of improvements were made as we begin to understand what's so great about Pokemon's fourth generation. The opening of Pokemon Diamond and Pearl aims to solidify how Game Freak is holding on to aspects of the franchise which cemented the Pokemon experience in the previous entries and improving on them without breaking the mold. While whichever gendered character you do not select to play as at the beginning of the game will become your peer through your Pokédex filling adventure, similar to Brendan or May in the last entry, you also have a brand new format of a third member to the group. This was originally planned for the very first games to have the trio of red, blue, and green characters, but was dropped during development. But in the fourth generation we will be introduced to our friend Barry. This completes the combat triangle and lets us interact with all three Pokemon starters in some capacity. Similarly to Gen 3, your first interaction with battling will be against a wild level 2 Pokemon, rather than the old school days of being handed a Pokemon in a lab and immediately facing off against your rival. Instead, it'll actually be a little while before you get the opportunity to see either of your rival's teams in action. The first time you see your non-selected rival in battle is actually as a partner in the new 2-player double battles. You'll also have more opportunities for these cooperative battles throughout the game, such as the escort missions with Cheryl and Riley. It isn't just limited to rival interactions. These little escort missions may not be side quests in the traditional RPG sense of the term, but they aid in fleshing out the world with more trainers throughout the region who are also training and exploring. We actually get to see other trainers and their Pokemon in action, rather than stumbling across another character as they finish up whatever they were doing and then leaving, like Steven in Gen 3. These sections also give you a dedicated healer, allowing longer stretches of combat without forcing the player to run back and forth to the Pokemon Center in the last town. Instead, players can stick around, catching and training to their heart's content in a wild area that would be comparable in length to early franchise sections such as Victory Road. Yet now, these kinds of sections of extended gameplay are possible earlier in the game by being set up as slightly more forgiving with the companionship of a medic to boost the abilities of players who aren't quite strategically adept or overflowing with money and healing items. Pokemon contests are also returning from the third generation, but have been made much more interesting, entertaining, and feasible to newcomers. I was never that into the Pokemon contests of Gen 3, but I thought the fourth generation made it a lot more enjoyable, not to mention understandable too. Instead of one single competition based on earning points while sabotaging your opponents, the new version has 3 categories: visual, dance, and acting. The visual section of the competition includes decorating your Pokemon with costumes and little additional pieces of flair that you may collect from strangers in shops while out on your journey. The dance section of the contest is a little follow-the-leader rhythm game. It's not exactly going to get the juices flowing for any Guitar Hero buffs out there, but it changes the pace, and again, makes things a little more interesting than just selecting from a drop-down menu. The final section of the contest is the acting portion, which was previously the entirety of the competition in the 3rd generation games. Now, it's a bit more understandable, however, and you no longer sabotage your fellow competitors. Instead, players will accumulate points based on which moves they use, which order they go in, which judge they appeal to, and a few other factors that usually come from the moves themselves. This allows for more of a mind game while deciding which move to use and which judge to focus on each round, without worrying so much about an opponent completely sabotaging your routine with a random attack at the end. All of these changes made the contest scene more digestible, as well as more entertaining overall. Not to mention, you can also now see contest types for moves when your Pokemon is leveling up, so it's a lot easier to build up a Pokemon in your collection that is purely for contests. Speaking of moves that your Pokemon can learn, move types of physical or special received a massive franchise-improving overhaul in the 4th generation. Fixing the specificity on physical versus special attacks changed battles dramatically in terms of being able to better utilize either form of attack outside of your Pokemon's types. It was much easier to cover your bases instead of having either a complete set of attacking or defending moves being rendered useless by a single type advantage, or the fact that your Pokemon so heavily relied on either physical or special moves. Following the 3rd generation, Diamond and Pearl solidified a pattern of each new region generally having its own rodent and bird Pokemon that could be discovered among the first few routes. This creates a sense of familiarity, but also establishes the unique environment of every generation's setting. In comparison to Hoenn's key feature, its vast stretches of ocean, Sinnoh is defined by the large mountain range splitting the region in half. What makes this feature more poignant is the existence of Pokemon species that change aesthetically based on region or environment, such as Gastrodon changing form based on whether it's from the east or west half of Sinnoh. The many newly introduced species of Pokemon that can be found in the Sinnoh region really flesh out the known Pokemon universe so far. Several different types of baby Pokemon were added to existing family lines, and many Pokemon were given new methods of evolution or additional evolutionary forms, even many standalone species from way back in Generation 1, such as Tangela and Lickitung. While I mention the improvements of this generation go far beyond the aesthetic developments, they are still obviously worth noting. While we're still in the world of digital sprites, the environment itself is actually 3D, allowing for a greater sense of depth to the world. This is exemplified right as the player starts up the game with sweeping shots of a world that isn't just from a singular angle anymore, and bird Pokemon flying high above the rest of the environment. Down below on the ground, however, overworld sprites are even more detailed than they were in Ruby and Sapphire. They have a sense of reality to them that wasn't possible on earlier devices, yet we haven't gone so far as to using the cartoony newer models either. Sprites of Pokemon in battle have also been developed further. Genders of Pokemon have been given different designs, for example. Sometimes this is pretty simple, like changing the size and shape of Luxray's head, or more drastic changes, such as completely changing Hippowdon's color. More interesting than the visual changes due to genders are the evolutionary changes due to genders, such as Burmy either evolving into Mothim if male or Wormadam if female, or Combee only evolving into Vespiquen if female, mimicking the real world's queen bees in nature. The cries of new Pokemon are also becoming much more elaborate, and in terms of audio design, the soundtrack is starting to feel less and less MIDI. In fact, Gen 4 sees the return of Time of Day after it was left out of the previous Pokemon games, but this time a dusk time frame has been added, as well as more gradual visual changes as day turns to night, or vice versa. These different times of day are also accompanied by changes to the soundtrack, with many different locations in both towns and routes having day and night variations, even indoors like at the Pokemon Center. The buildings of Sinnoh have much more unique and interesting designs, down to the window shapes and outdoor decorations. Previous generations of Pokemon games felt like they were just filled with houses and office buildings that all had slightly different layouts or names. But now, even if they aren't intrinsic to the story or gameplay, you can still tell what different buildings are meant to be. The cities can be filled with churches, harbors, libraries, and any other buildings that give a little more character to each town you pass through. Some of the most important buildings every player visits have also been improved, and that would be the Pokemon gyms. There are many new puzzles in the gyms now. The whole gimmick isn't just get to the leader while avoiding as many trainers as you can or want. Now there are actually puzzles, sometimes based on many of the new features like height, and reflect the types and nature of the gym you're in. These puzzles may also vary between Diamond or Pearl and their later counterpart, Platinum. I've avoided discussing each generation's third counterpart version up until now because generally, they didn't offer enough differences to warrant that much discussion. Usually, the changes were aesthetic, such as having slightly different sprites, or Crystal and Emerald having little battle animations for each Pokemon, or different approaches to some legendary creatures. Of course, Pokemon Yellow, I'd say, was the most different with its connections to the anime, such as Pikachu following you, the additional interactions with Team Rocket, and access to different Pokemon, such as all 3 starters, but again, this felt like more of a fan service update of the game and generally followed the same path as Pokemon Red and Blue. However, Pokemon Platinum was the first time that Game Freak really dipped their toes into trying new things for the same generation. Many of these were minute, such as swapping where you could obtain certain items and attacks, or the changes to the user interface, or the aesthetic changes of snow in new areas or fog in others. These may not have been drastic or mandatory, but they were nice. Platinum version also balanced some things with the inclusion of a few of the National Dex Pokemon earlier in the game, which made things a little more interesting and also fixed a couple odd scenarios, such as the complete lack of fire types in Diamond and Pearl. As of Pokemon Platinum as well, any legendary or otherwise event-based Pokemon in the overworld were given multiple chances for capture, in case the player messes up their shot the first time. Instead, after defeating the Elite Four and accessing the Hall of Fame each time, the missable Pokemon will respawn and can be found in their respective areas for another opportunity not previously presented to Pokemon players. Platinum also added a completely new section to the game that wasn't just a new spot to catch Pokemon, but a unique area that contributed to a different story and experience, this of course being the Distortion World atop Mount Coronet. This set a basis for Game Freak's approach to the more varied 2nd edition games for some generations later on, such as Black and White 2 or Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon. The 4th generation entries are the first games in the Pokemon series to really have some endgame content. I mean, technically you could consider the ability to go to Kanto in Gen 2 a form of endgame content, since it happens after the Pokemon League, but as discussed in our 2nd generation video, that really is just the second half of the game, possibly with your Expedition of Mount Silver being the real post-game content. But in the 4th generation, after the Elite Four, you have access to the Battle Zone sub-region, including 3 whole new towns, access to several new areas throughout Sinnoh, as well as the ability to discover and capture multiple new legendary Pokemon, beyond either a Big 3 or version exclusives. Once again, the continuation of lore expands the individual games as well as the overall Pokemon experience for those who want something beyond the Pokemon League. The 4th generation is also the first time that you can easily complete a Seen All Pokemon Pokédex without even the use of another cartridge or the other game version. All Pokemon, even starters and legendaries, are displayed to the player in some capacity to allow for a fully seen Pokédex without real-world trading. This makes the core sense of completion much more attainable to all sorts of players out there. After completing the Sinnoh Pokédex, players also have access to the PAL Park, a one-way transfer site of Pokemon from the 3rd generation cartridges, utilizing the Nintendo DS's Game Boy Advance slot to self-transfer your collection from previous entries. However, this isn't the only way to find the Pokemon for your newly updated National Dex. Several species of earlier Pokemon will now appear in the wild throughout Sinnoh, and your rival's younger sister will give daily information on where to find these new Pokemon. Wild Pokemon will also change based on which Game Boy Advance Pokemon cartridge is currently inserted into the bottom slot of the DS. Along with the new towns and training areas found after the Elite Four, the Battle Zone also gives you the chance to see nearly every species of Pokemon in combat, and several new Pokemon can be obtained on the routes between the fight, survival, and resort areas of the new island, as well as at Stark Mountain itself. All this is to say that in the 4th generation of Pokemon, your journey doesn't end when the credits roll on your last big battle, and the world is still opening up to you more and more as you continue to grow as a Pokemon trainer. The 4th generation of Pokemon was one of the most comfortable generations, at least in my eyes. There were so many quality of life improvements to the Pokemon franchise that it just felt like the next improved step in the development of the series. These changes greatly benefited the user experience, gameplay, and story. The lore of the Pokemon universe is being deepened, such as delving a little more into the past relationships of Pokemon and humans, as well as establishing more about how the Pokemon world came to be the way it is. This is done through the advancement of storytelling tools that were virtually non-existent in the more technically limited Game Boy Pokemon games, as well as in the content of the world itself, from geography to the information in books and on TV. Interaction with other players also was greatly expanded beyond just character-deprived interactions in a single room. The new ability to travel and explore underground provided a much more interesting way to spend time with friends outside of battles and trades. Here you could set up secret bases and set traps to toy with each other. The underground also provided a much easier way to find certain items, such as fossils and evolutionary stones. Heart scales also became a much more common occurrence, making it easier to relearn moves you may have missed out on due to having trouble evolving a Pokemon with specific requirements. It's been a while in the Pokemon franchise since we've seen so much focus on quality of life improvements, other than making things easier for younger players in the newest titles. But Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum all demonstrate that making something more simplified, more creative, more diversified, and not necessarily easier or harder are all good enough means of creating a new enjoyable experience in a series where things often feel the same from game to game. The majority of the Pokemon player base enjoys the core of the franchise. They like the same games they grew up with, and they don't necessarily expect or probably even want something that strays too far from that path. But presenting the old format with a little polish here and there, or new ways of achieving your goals, could create a vastly improved experience for lifelong players. These games manage to do that without necessarily sticking out as something different, and that is what's so great about Pokemon's 4th generation. Thank you all for joining us on this episode of What's So Great About Gaming, as we took a closer look at the land of Sinnoh in Pokemon's 4th generation. Make sure to tell us what you think about Pokemon Gen 4, or even suggest a game for another video. If you want to hear what's great about another game, check out the link to our last episode, Horizon Zero Dawn, on screen or in the description, and please take the time to subscribe to be involved in the discussions here. Thanks again for watching. Now go play a great game. We'll see you next time.